this year's Baggett Lectures. This being a huge, big deal that David Baggett has generously endowed, we need an introduction to the speaker. Right? So Norbert Hornstein, who's I think the only person here who's taught David, will tell us an anecdote, because I hate long introductions, and apparently he does too. So Norbert.
Okay, so before I give the short introduction to David, I want to, everyone here who's taking Syntax 2, we're meeting tomorrow. Tough luck. 2 to 3:30, then we'll break for David. Okay, then we'll meet again. Just kidding. Okay, so 2 to 3:30, just one. So it's really my pleasure to introduce David. David actually constitutes an important shift in the Baggett Lectures, as far as I can see. Deeply relevant for me. And why should that be a cause for amusement? I mean, all lectures are understood from a personal point of view, and this is now an important moment, an important point at which we shift from those people I studied from to those people I taught, right? And so that now makes these lectures that much more interesting, because everything you hear David say that's wrong, I had nothing to do with, and everything that you hear David say that's right, I would like to thank you right now for agreeing. Okay? David actually was taught by me in a ludicrously bad place. It was Nijmegen in January about 25 years ago. Nijmegen in January, David tells me, is exactly like Scotland all the time. It's overcast, it's rainy, and it's cold. And, this is the other thing that makes it just like Scotland, there's lots of good beer. I was teaching actually a course on minimalism. It was really funny. It was, I think it must have been about 94 that I gave this thing, 93, 94, because the first minimalist paper came out. As you all know, the 93 paper, chapter 3, was in fact made public by some Korean students stealing it off of Chomsky's desk and making it available to the world, right? And the whole world got this, and we poured over it. And I can assure you that the very first thing I concluded after reading that paper is that Chomsky had lost his mind, right? Everything that we knew looked like it was wrong, and so he had to be incorrect. Whether or not that's true, I'll leave for you to judge. However, what was interesting, I was then asked to give a bunch of lectures teaching something, so what I decided to do is teach the minimalist paper and argue that it was completely correct. I had no idea how it was completely correct, but somehow it seemed like a fun thing to do. And David was in the class, as were, I think, Alexiadou and Anna Gostopoulou and a whole bunch of other people. And every time I said something, and I literally mean this almost sentence by sentence, I was stopped by some intelligent remark, some of which came from David. And it was really a remarkably stimulating and exciting time. And that's how I got to meet him for the first time. And since then, he's become a big deal in the field. And it's with tremendous pleasure that we have him giving 3 lectures here. The first one is, oh my God, a menagerie of merges. I have a feeling that I'm in for some bad innings here. But it's really terrific to have him here, and I can't wait to hear what he has to say. I assume you're going to be generally available for people to bug you?
We've done some emailing already.
Okay, that's great. And so without further ado, short introduction, David Adger.
Thanks very much, Robert. Do you want me to wear this? Is it necessary for me to put this
Yeah,
down?
it is. The acoustics in the background.
I hope you're not going to be deafened. That's the only problem. Does that work?
What?
Does that work? Okay, so many thanks to Dave Baggett and to you guys for inviting me here. I'm really, really pleased to be here. It's really nice to see that you've put on some Nijmegen/Scottish summer weather for me here, right? Overcast, grey, snowy. So yes, great to be here. And what I'm going to do in these 3 lectures is attempt to restrict the theory a little bit. So today I'm going to talk mainly about head movement and why there isn't any. And then tomorrow I'll talk about roll-up movement for word order reasons, and actually all roll-up movement, and why there isn't any. And then on the 3rd day, I'm going to focus really on sideways movement, which is one of Norbert's favorite things, and I'm going to say why there isn't any. So Yeah, well, we'll see how that one goes. Overall, the general theme of the lectures is really how to try and keep a minimal syntactic technology, but at the same time keep the theory restrictive. Okay, so there's a general kind of issue between questions of simplicity of theories and their restrictiveness that was actually quite important for a long time back in the 70s, right? So back in the 70s, there was a bit of a debate going on between the generative semanticist and the interpretive semanticist. You all remember this? I was 5. And that debate had a lot of stuff going on in it. But one aspect of it was really about the question of whether it's better to have a simpler theory. There's a theory where you say less, okay, and that was the generative semanticists who were going, yeah, we should have really simple theories. And then, or whether you should have a theory that was restrictive. They really attempted to, hone down the range of possible grammars that human beings can attain to the ones that, theoretically, to the ones that they do actually obtain empirically. So that period actually made this tension between simplicity and restrictiveness quite an important tension in the field, and surprisingly enough, Chomsky won, right? And basically things came down on the side of restrictiveness for quite some time, okay? So, back in the 70s, we had this kind of big zoo of transformations, right? We had things like sluicing, WH movement, my favorite, Richard. You guys know the transformation Richard? It's a great transformation. It's you should look it up sometime. And there's some really good papers by Asida looking at these things where it goes like Richard the First, Richard the Second, Richard the Third. Yeah. So this range of different transformations was legitimized essentially by a very, very simple basic theory of what the underlying basic transformations could be. Okay? So there were essentially 3 things you could do. You could substitute things, you could delete things, and you could join things. And out of those 3 basic bits and pieces, you ended up by, being able to do an awful lot, right? In fact, you ended up being able to do almost anything that was computable at all, which really gives you a very kind of way too loose the relationship between the forms that you see and the meanings that you have. And so that was, the generative semanticists lost that battle because Chomsky pointed out over and over and over again that, sure, it's good to have a simple theory, but it's better to have a theory that does what you want it to do, right? So there's something quite similar, I think, going on currently. If you look at construction grammar, for example, right, you see in construction, I always have to throw in an anti-construction grammar thing wherever I go, right? So you see in construction grammar, it's very much like 1970s transformational grammar. Right, so basically construction grammar has a set of semantic stuff, rather less well defined than actually we had in the 70s. And it has a set of forms, again, rather well less defined than what we have. And then we used to have a kind of unbounded relationship between them, that's true, and that's what the construction grammarians have. So I think that's a little bit of a step back, really, right, to go from something that's fairly something that's fairly restricted meaning-wise, something that's fairly restricted form-wise, and an unrestricted relation to no restrictions at all. So, okay, so that's my little stamping my feet against construction grammar, which I occasionally have to do. So, minimalism came along, around about the time when Norbert gave that course, a little bit before. And part of the important thing about minimalism was that it attempted to reduce the complexity of the theory that had been built up during the years of GB, which was really a time of introducing complexity in order to get a sense of the restrictiveness of natural language grammars. And minimalism attempted to simplify that while maintaining the restrictiveness. That was the whole idea, okay? And the ways that it attempted to do this was to essentially farm out some of the complexity to the interfaces, or how the syntax had to look to be usable by the systems of sound and by the systems of meaning. If you could figure that out, then that might explain some of the complexity that you apparently see in the syntax, okay? And then other aspects of that complexity, Chomsky argued, could be seen as, and this is something that's been developing slowly over time, could be seen as some set of conditions on exactly the computational complexity of the operations that are involved. Right? That's not meant to be understood as like, how you parse things or anything like that. That's, you need to essentially say there's a computable function that generates these structures. And the question is, if it's a computable function, how is it simple? Right? So that was the basic idea. And, a big success story of that, I think, is essentially the reduction of complexity in having 2 bits from the phrase structure rules on one side and the movement rules on another side to a single thing, merge, one rule to rule them all, as I called it, merge. What that did, of course, is it simplified the structure of the theory, okay? And at the same time, it actually opened up new explanatory modes of understanding things like reconstruction effects and binding and this kind of stuff. So, that was a real success, and that was the major initial success, I think, of the minimalist program in attempting to solve the complexity that had been introduced over the GB years without losing the restrictiveness. Okay? So, but I'm going to argue that things are getting a bit out of hand again. And our current system, so I've been reading a bunch of MIT theses lately, and there's a lot of different ways of doing merge these days, right? So we have the few that were introduced initially, so external merge and internal merge, which is the same thing, okay? Which is that was the unification between phrase structure theory and the theory of movement. And then we have self-merge, which has been used by Guimaraes and Kane and me, and we'll come back to that later on. And then a bunch of other ones. Under merge, parallel merge, late merge, wholesale late merge. And then we have a whole pile of different derivational types you can build with these various kinds of operations. Tucking in derivations versus extending derivations, head merger, roll-up movement, and so on. Okay? And I'm just getting a bit itchy about this kind of level of complexity that's coming back into the theory. And so what I want to do today, really, and tomorrow marches on this Becky pace through. It's hard to not do Shakespeare when you say tomorrow and tomorrow, right? Is to argue that really we should reduce the number of options that our theory gives us for different types of derivations. Okay? And we should do it in the ways that Chomsky initially suggested for minimalism. That is, we should try and see to what extent the syntactic system itself is optimized to the interfaces, and I'm going to focus on the interface with semantics, and I'll talk about that in just a second, and by attempting to optimize the basic operations of the syntax itself. Okay? Please feel free to interrupt me. I know I haven't said anything surprising yet, but I'm happy to be interrupted at any point, except by Norbert. I don't mean. Okay, so basically on Wednesday, I'm going to talk about the structure building system itself being optimized. Okay, that's going to be about what the nature of merge is itself, and I'm going to argue that merge actually has a bit more structure to it, so it's a bit more restricted, but that is actually a way of being simpler. That sounds a bit paradoxical now, but that's what I'm going to argue. And then today and tomorrow I'm going to focus on how to theorize about a syntactic system that's well designed for the interface with semantics, and that's essentially going to rule out for us head movement and also roll-up movement. Okay? So why do I say optimize towards meaning? So we've got 2 interfaces with syntax at least. The interface with compositional meaning and the interface with sounds and signs and all that kind of stuff. The arguments for this are very old. A very strong argument, I think, is because, basically syntactic rules are order-free, right? Core syntactic rules do not make reference to order. We don't find things like agree with the preceding noun phrase. So an example like the girls from the Western Isles are singing is bad, right? Even though Western Isles is plural and it's the immediately preceding noun phrase to are, and that's bad in all, that kind of rule is bad in all languages that we know of, okay? There are some weird little exceptions, so there's like first agreement with conjuncts and stuff, but they have other explanations and we'll ignore them. So I think that's one reason why we want to think about syntax itself as looking not towards pronunciation, where order is determined, but rather towards meaning. And then another example, which is basically Chomsky's example of this, he uses that complicated thing about eagles flying and undoubtedly and stuff, but I can never get that straight in my head, so this is my version of it. So it was in the garage that the people who were dancing were singing. Okay? That has a paraphrase that the people who were dancing were singing in the garage, but it doesn't have a paraphrase that the people who were dancing in the garage were singing. Even though, I mean, you can feel that in your bones, right? Even though, of course, I mean, they're probably very likely to be the same situation. Okay, so something, what that shows you is again that the kind of locality that's relevant to create the dependency between in the garage here and the gerunds or the participles here, rather, is not one based on what comes first. It's based on the structural relation. Okay, so those are the reasons why one might want to talk about the system being optimized not to pronunciation. It just doesn't look like syntax cares about these aspects of pronunciation in terms of linear order or what comes first. Okay. So this will be very. I mean, so I prepared this for a bunch of general cognitive sciencey type people, but I'm informed that everyone in the room is a linguist, more or less. So some of this will just be me kind of going through the motions. But some people might not have kind of heard it presented this way, so I'll try it. All right. So there's a classical aspect of generative grammar that goes back to the very earliest moments of generative grammar, which is the notion that syntactic objects have to be defined by some kind of recursive procedure. Okay, that's been around since the very earliest days. And these days, the kind of way that people think about this is essentially like this inductive definition of syntactic objects, right? So you say that a bunch of lexical items are syntactic objects. You have to figure out what they are. And then you say, if something's a syntactic object and something else is a syntactic object, then the set containing those is a syntactic object. So we have this recursive definition which just tells you what legitimate syntactic objects are meant to look like. Okay? Yeah?
Oh, I was just commenting. You need a base step to never get syntactic object.
Yeah, well that's the base step here. X1 to Xn are syntactic objects, right? So this is the base step, okay? This is the inductive or recursive clause, and then this is the nothing else is syntactic object clause. All right, so what this will give us is essentially, basically, a statement about what legitimate syntactic objects are going to look like. They're either going to be lexical items, they're going to be sets containing lexical items, or they're going to be sets containing syntactic objects. Okay? All right. So, of course, the reason for having a recursive definition was Chomsky's observation a long time ago that this captures a really important classical observation about language, that it's hierarchical and there doesn't seem to be any numerical bound on that hierarchy. Right? There are questions about parsing. It's very difficult to do center embedding more than a certain number of times, but those don't seem to be about the syntax itself. They seem to be about how we're using the syntax. Again, very well-known observation. This is very trivial, but we were having a conversation just after lunch today about how people in cognitive neuroscience just have a very hard time accepting that there is hierarchy in language, full stop. And it's definitely true. So I wrote a paper a while back with Jennifer Culbertson, and we were looking at examples like the 3 green balls, those kinds of things, right? And what we did was we did an experiment where we essentially taught people an artificial language, which was basic, and we gave them just a fragment of that language. So we gave them something like balls these, or balls 3, or balls green. And then they had to figure out what that language would look like, right, if you had more than one thing after the noun. And it's kind of an interesting thing to do this, because if you're thinking that there's no hierarchy, and it's really just about what word is likely to come after what next word, or what class of words is likely to come after some other class of words, then what you would predict is that you would get something like green, those 3 balls, right? Sorry, balls, those 3 green, yeah. So I don't know where green came in first there. That's not a language. Okay, so you get balls, those 3 green, because obviously those normally comes before 3, which normally comes before green. But if you reverse that and go, can I do this off the top of my head? So balls, green, 3, those, right? That's just much less likely if what you're doing is you're following the transitional probabilities between words. And of course, what do people do? They all generalize to the reverse, the mirror order. And we'll talk more about that set of questions tomorrow. But when I presented this to psychologists, they were like, well, no, that can't, they were like, what? That just makes no sense whatsoever. No, it must be the transitional probabilities. Why? Because they don't think there's any hierarchy. But we know, now that I know who you guys are, we know there's hierarchy, and that, of course, follows from the definition of syntactic object. Okay. As it stands, and this is something that, again, people outside of linguistics often fail to recognize, the definition of syntactic object doesn't capture the linked meaning and form as it stands. We need something more than that, right? So there's a lot of, I've had huge arguments with various people who say, well, Chomsky says that, there's only recursion in natural language and that's it. Well, how can you say anything about, how natural language works then? And they fail to realize that that's not ever been the claim. The claim is that you need a recursive operation to generate structures, and those structures interface in a systematic way with both form and with sound and with meaning. Okay? So we need something else. Essentially, that says that syntactic structures are mappable to the external cognitive systems. So we have a syntactocentric view of the world. Right? Jack McDuff uses that as a kind of insult. I think it's a profound compliment. Okay, so, and as I said earlier on, what I'm going to talk about today is the intuition that syntax is optimally structured to interface with compositional meaning, and one version of that is that we don't have syntactic work done in the system without semantic gain. Okay? So the syntax is well adapted to the semantics in as much as it doesn't do stuff unless the semantics is going to have some feeling about what's going on in the syntax. Okay? All right. So, we're coming towards the end of the introductory bit. And I'm sure you guys already know this too. So when Chomsky initially talked about the merger, that's a bad word to use, the putting together, I'm having one of those lexical access issues. Thank you very much, Howard. The unification of phrase structure and movement, okay? He did this by essentially saying, well, look, logically there are two ways, he said, there's actually three, of course. Logically there are two ways that if you've got two things and we put them together in a set, they could work. One is they're distinct elements, right? And another one is that one is part of the other. So that was the essential unification of merger and movement that we see here. There is, of course, a third possibility, which is occasionally mentioned but not very much is done with. And I'm going to come back to that at the end today, which is actually when the two things are the same. Okay, they're identical. So we're putting two A's together, but of course, since these are really sets, this is just a structure containing alpha. Or something. Okay. Now, I've said already that I think that this basic, the basic recursive definition is very loose, because it's really just a guideline for what syntactic objects are like. It's not actually a theory in terms of saying what mechanisms implement how these objects are actually built up. And we're going to have to build such a theory, and that's what I'll be doing essentially in the third lecture. Okay, so today we're going to look at head movement. And the basic intuition that people have, I think, is that if lexical items are syntactic objects, and syntactic objects can internally merge, as we just saw earlier on, then lexical items can internally merge, and that is just head movement. Lexical item's a head, and it just moves. So in something like 7, might the cat scratch Anson, that's obviously connected to the sentence, the cat might scratch Anson, and there we have a simple case of what looks like taking a lexical item might and moving it into some higher kind of position. Okay, so, what I'm going to argue is that the kind of derivations in current research that implement head movement all look a bit suspicious. They all require something a bit weird, and I'm going to go through what those weird things are. I'm also going to argue that these operations create structures that feed, they're intended to create structures that feed word building, right? They intend to feed into morphology, create complex words, but actually, whether you move or not turns out to be entirely tangential to how the syntax creates complex words. That is, you can find the creation of complex words where there's demonstrably no movement. Okay? So you can't say that head movement, it's going to be the argument, is the thing that's responsible for building words. Okay? And I'm going to also argue that head movement doesn't seem to feed meaning, ever. Right? So it's kind of intuitive, this idea. I mean, if you think about it, head movement's one of the ways that people use to capture parametric variation between languages. So if you look at, for example, a Gallic sentence where you put the verb first, and a corresponding English sentence where you put the verb after the subject, then you normally don't want to say, oh, these feed different information to the semantics. Okay? They tend to be seen as paraphrases of each other. And that means that the syntax, if it's doing head movement, would be doing work, but not making any impact upon the semantics. I'm going to argue it's more general than that actually head movement does, all the examples where people have argued that head movement does feed semantics are just incorrect. Yeah?
So the syntax does plenty of stuff that nobody thinks feeds the semantics, like agreement and case.
Aha. We'll come back to that at the very end. Okay. Well, actually, let me answer you right now so I know where we're going. It's true that what I'm talking about is the structure building operation. So head movement is the structure is currently thought of as a structure building operation, right? It's not a feature checking operation. It might involve it, but like it's a structure building operation. And this little motto, no syntactic work without semantic gain, is really about where I'm defining work here as structure building, because that's what I'm interested in, the structure building operation. Okay, so I'm going to argue that we're better off with a system that doesn't allow syntactic head movement, and I'm going to show you what such a system might look like. I need to think about my time. Okay, that can't really be the time, can it? Okay, so very briefly, again, this is just revision for most of you guys. So the first thing head movement does is it captures relations between syntactic positions. So here's the tree for the sentence we saw earlier on, the classic tree that you'll all draw in Linguistics 101. We take might and we adjoin it to C, and we get the movement operation happening here. Okay? With some kind of complex head here, and then that's it. That's all we need to do. Okay, so head movement's used to capture positional differences between heads and specifiers in a structure. Okay? The second thing it does is what I just mentioned. It captures relations not just within languages like we've seen, right? The relationship between might the cat scratch Hansen and the cat might scratch Hansen, but also the relation between languages. So here's, I'm missing a graph here, but anyway, so here's skrop and cat ein, so scratch the cat in, okay? And you see that what we've got here is verb, subject, object, as opposed to the English subject, verb, object. And in the Japanese case, there's lots of questions about how you might handle that, but at least some people handle it by saying the verb hasn't moved at all. And then the last thing that it does is it feeds morphology and builds complex words. And so here's a little example of French. So, parle-t-il français? And what we've done is we've taken essentially a bit of a word here, something like parle. We've connected it with the inflection here, which would be A, and then that's moved into the higher position, giving parle-t-il. Okay? So it does these jobs of positioning, but also building structure. And that's fundamental to the nature of head movement. Of course, as syntacticians, we're not really interested in structures. Wow. I think we shouldn't be at some level, but we really are. In fact, I think that part of the reason that head movement has hung on so long, even though clearly it's a bad idea, is that people are just fetishistic about the basic kind of structure. They just don't, that's what they got taught in grad school or in undergraduate, and they just don't want to get rid of it. So I think there's a problem there. I notice I've gone all Scottish here. Although we have such a fetish for structures that we can't abandon them easily. Okay, so what we're really interested in, of course, is the system that generates structures, right? And that means that we better have a system that's able to generate those structures. Those are the structures we want. I'm going to argue we don't want them, and so we don't want our system generating them. But I mean, if you want those structures, you better have a system that works to give you them. Okay, so I mentioned there's lots of ways of doing head movement. So Pozetsky has something he calls undermerge. Bobby Brown, Nunes, Norbert, and various other people have sideways movement. Chitko doesn't really do head movement with parallel merge, but Narita does in that thesis. Matishansky has a story which involves kind of interweaving the morphology and the syntax. So it's normal merge plus a bit of morphological merger. And then I'm not going to talk about roll-up today, but there's also a roll-up view, which isn't really head movement. You say there isn't head movement. What you do is you roll everything up into the right order. Okay? I think it's a little bit scary that our theory allows us such latitude. I sort of think it shouldn't at some level. And I think that all of these approaches lead to unfulfilled expectations about head movement in terms of how things build words and in terms of how head movement might relate to the systems of semantic interpretation. So I'm going to briefly run through these and show you the problems. Well, I won't show you the problems. What I'm going to show you is what all these different kinds of things do. They all build the same kind of structure. And then we'll move on to see why actually that kind of structure is not the structure we want. All right, so undermerge, Pazetsky motivates this as essentially a symmetry between moving something to a specifier versus moving something to a complement. Right? So if you take something like x, y, z here, Pazetsky's idea is, well, you can move that y up here to the spec of x, but you can move it here and it would be the complement of x. It would be the sister to the head x. Okay? And that's what he calls undermerge, and that's how you generate that kind of structure. Now, generally syntacticians don't like mucking around with structure that's already been built. Not all syntacticians don't like that, but some of them don't. But that's the way that undermerge works. So compare that to sideways movement, which I have redubbed Tarzan merge, partly because I find this. So in Tarzan merge, you essentially have two separate syntactic objects, okay? And you swing from one to the other one, right? So you swing this y from here into the x. Okay? So what you get then is essentially two subtrees here, okay? And then later on you might do some work and stick them together. Okay? So notice that's unlike undermerge in that you're not mucking around the structure you've already built. So it's an improvement on undermerge from that perspective. What you're doing instead is you're moving into a tree that you're not already connected to. And then you're connecting later on. Very similar to that is parallel merge. So Norman and I had a bit of a discussion about this today, but like at least some versions of parallel merge take y and z and then directly merge x with y. So that gives us a multi-dominant structure where there's something both dominating y, which is the mother of x, and something dominating y, which is the mother of z. So we have this non-tree, we have this little kind of upside-down W type structure. And as I said, Narita essentially uses that to mimic head movement, to build a kind of head movement type structure. And then some people think that we need to join these to have a well-formed tree. Other people think, no, the interfaces know how to deal with that. Okay. So we don't really need this. That's just my graphic. Okay, so then there's a third or fourth way to get the same structure. And this is Matushansky's approach to things, which seems very popular these days. I don't know why. And Matushansky's view essentially takes a head, moves it into some higher position here, right, which is a completely legitimate movement. It's just normal movement, right? And then it does something squidgy, and then you make that out of it, right? So what morphological merger is that squidgy thing, right? So I think that if you think about this in terms of syntactic objects, well, actually, there's one thing to say before I get there. I mean, there is an interesting thing about this this approach, in that it actually dissociates the position in terms of movement from the notion of word formation. It does a bit of dissociation, right? But then what it does is it interweaves them back together again at every step, right? Now, I think the dissociation is the right thing to do, right? But what goes wrong is the interweaving back into each step. So if you think about it in terms of syntactic objects, what you're doing is you're taking this kind of structure here, and then you're moving the y out to create that there, and then you're shipping it off. That's the ferry to sky. You're shipping it off into the morphology, and you're doing something which, I don't know how to write this, but you're doing something which creates a morphological object out of it. So I put angled brackets because I'm kind of assuming the morphological objects are ordered. Right? And then what you need to do is you need to ship it back into the syntax because you might want to move the thing again. Right? You might want to head move it once more. And I'm not quite sure whether you stop it being a morphological object at that point, whether you magically turn it back to the syntactic object, what you do, but you do something. Okay? So I think that that's actually, there's something right about the notion that Matushansky has that you dissociate word building from height, but I think this is a very kludgy way of doing it. Okay, so in summary, we have a lot of different ways to get head movement effects. And notice I say head movement effects, that is word building and position, okay? We have various particular versions of merge operations. I think the theory is lax in the kind of, in the range of operations it legitimizes, and I actually think the structures that it builds for head movement are not right. So I think we can ask, actually, what kind of properties would be, if head movement really is a structure building operation like this, what kind of things would we expect to see at the interfaces? We'd expect to see head movement having semantic effects. We'd expect to see essentially head movement having morphological effects. Okay. So Klaus Abels, way back in his thesis, noticed, and I think it'd been noticed a number of times before, that a corollary of the idea that head movement creates structures that feed into morphology is that syntactic height should correlate with morphological complexity. And he gave some, English, the English auxiliary system is a case which, is a veritable hoary case in syntax, which doesn't look like this, but that's what one would expect. Masha?
I don't know if you're going to talk about noun incorporation as head movement. That's where semantics is clearly in that.
Yeah, I don't think noun incorporation is head movement.
Okay.
I wasn't going to talk about it, but we could, but maybe at the end, yeah?
Right.
And I'll just, I can riff on it a bit,
Right.
but I haven't thought about it enough. I think noun incorporation is very small syntax before you begin to do other stuff. That's basically what I think. So it's a little bit like compounding, but it's not quite compounding. But we can maybe talk about that. Okay, so Abel's, so French looks great from the perspective of this, right? It looks really good because actually the higher you move, the more complex you've got. But I'm going to give you a counter argument from actually a while back from this book that Daniel Harbour, Laurel Watkins and I wrote about Kiowa. I want to give this as a public thing because no one ever reads that book. And it is ridiculously dense, and so I don't blame people, but I think this is a quite striking counter-argument. Okay, so Kiowa, which is the Kiowa-Tanoan language, is very endangered, spoken by, when we started working on it, there were about late 30s number of speakers, and we're down to late 20s now. They're all in their 80s or so. We had a project funded by the UK Research Councils to essentially look at whether there is phrase structure in a non-configurational language. Right? This is some of the output of that project. So it is actually a head final language, although we'll see some cases where we find things after the verb. Okay? And it has very rich suffixation. So if you have a look here, Daniel will kill me when I pronounce these, but it's always good to try and pronounce things, right? So, et dans mon head. Okay, so second singular, be not evidential. Right? So we've got a suffix for negation, a suffix for evidentiality, and then down here there's a better one. So, au bon hont au yit au day. Oh, it's being recorded, right? Daniel will see it. Damn. Okay, so here you see aspect, and then modality, and then evidentiality. So it's got rich inflection for these categories on the verb. And it's a little bit like ne pas in French, okay? In that you can have these inflections, and they generally, although not always, occur with a pre-verbal particle, okay? So here we have béton, which is something like unbeknownst, I wasn't aware. It's an evidential kind of particle. And then we have the negation here, home, and that is essentially mirrored in the verb by ma and he. Okay? And that's the general way it works. So the order of these particles is rigid, even though it's a very free word or language. These particles are rigid when we find these elements in the verb, such that they always mirror around the axis of the verb. Okay? So we call this the Kiowa clausal mirror, and you want to say something like the kind of classical view of ne pas in French. That is that the various elements, like mo, which is the negative inflection, and hedel, which is the evidential inflection, that these are heads to some projections, and that either as specifiers or adjoined we have the particles. Okay? So, we'd expect something like this, but obviously if we have head initial structures here, right, in the tree, that's going to give us a problem. Well, you don't know it's going to give us a problem yet, but it will. So if you move don here, up to neg, and then up to hedel, right, what we predict is you should get hon after the verb. Right? And that's just out. You can have things after the verb, you can't ever have these pre-verbal, clues in the name, selected particles. Okay? So this is just ungrammatical. I don't snore. Ya, they, on, no, hon. You can never have these things after the verb. So that can't be the right way of doing it. In the book, we looked at various other kinds of pre-verbal ways of doing it, but none of them work either. So you can try making everything head final, right? So if everything's head final, right, whether the verb raises or not, you're going to expect to see the various arguments of the verb before it. Right? There's no obvious way to get the verb, whether it stays in situ or whether it moves, to come before these particles. The here is just you, is the argument, right? But that's not true. So it turns out that actually you can get things after the verb in Kiowa. It occurs in certain kinds of weird discourse effects. So like it seems to mark the end of turns. It's got a certain kind of narrative feel to it. And you can have, in the texts we worked with a bunch of texts. In the text there are lots of examples of post-verbal single arguments, post-verbal single adverbs. But when we actually worked with the speakers, it turns out you can have more than one thing after the verb. Okay? So, and the interesting thing is that what the things that come after the verb have to occur essentially in the order object, indirect object, subject, adverbs. Right? So sort of the inverse of their base positions, if you like. Right? If you imagine that really you have adverbs highest up, right, and then subjects, indirect objects, and then direct objects, and then the verb. What you find in these backwards constructions is they have to occur in that inverse base order. Okay, so you can say making coffee carry object subject, but not making carry coffee subject object. Okay. Similar with adverbs, the arguments always precede all of the adverbs if they occur afterwards. Right, so you can get Carl constantly, but you can never have constantly Carl. Okay? So basically you've got this, what we call the inverse base effect, and that becomes very difficult to explain if you have head final inflections, right? So imagine we've got subject and object here, and we've got the verb, and then this, and then this. How do we get these in the right order with respect to the verb? So there isn't any space in the tree, right? Now, if you try and think of this essentially as some kind of exposition, then you don't predict the strict order. In fact, the fact that they can't occur after adverbs suggests it's not like exposition. And actually, if you look at relative clauses can extrapose past adverbs, and they have and then they're free. So we do find expositions, but it doesn't look like this is exposition. So basically, under none of these cases where we have these higher things, we either move the verb up or we leave it down, or we have the head initial things, can we get the interaction between the mirror effect and the inverse base effect, right? I mean, you could try swinging these over here, but then of course you're going to end up getting the verb, then the subject, then the inflection. It's never going to work for you. Okay. So I think this is a very strong argument that we actually want to, much like the morphological mirror theory says in a sense, dissociate entirely the word building operation from the syntactic movement type operation. So, and the story that we eventually give, it doesn't look quite like this, but this looks a little bit less scary than Brodian mirror theory. But the solution we eventually gave is we said, well, look, the subject and the object can basically swing around the axis of the verb, as can certain variables that can join on either side. You can imagine these as a joining on either side, if you like. Okay? And then the pronunciation of the verb is here, right down at the bottom. And so to get all of the inflections, what you do is you essentially pronounce the verb, and then you pronounce the extended projection, bring it all the way up. right? And that will give you the mirror order of the affixes, right? So you pronounce the verb, and then you'll pronounce aspect, and then you pronounce negation, and then you pronounce mood. That's essentially Brody's mirror theory. That's the way he does morphology. But what that does is it entirely dissociates the two things. Okay? So I think that's actually a fairly strong argument that whatever complex structure the syntax feeds to the morphology, it's not built up by successive adjunctions by the verb, at least in Kiowa, and I would suggest more generally. Certainly we don't need it to a simpler and better story involves the morphology being fed to the external projection, the morphology being fed to the external projection of the verb, and that allows you to dissociate height and word building, right? But then there's no morphological motivation, there's no motivation from the structure of words for building these head adjunction structures that we looked at, no matter how we build them, under merge, parallel merge, sideways merge, whatever. We don't need them, right? So I think there's something suspicious about the richness of the operations, and I think we want to say that those operations aren't involved in building words. Yeah?
You keep going back and saying that hitting on the richness of operations and saying you've got unconstrained theory, but isn't that confusing the vocabulary of the theory? None of these people are saying you can do all these 6 things. They're all saying, here's the one that I think you're doing.
I agree, yeah.
And so, that's not really fair.
Maybe it's not fair. Yeah, okay.
When you say you want a constrained theory, that's different from saying you want a constrained vocabulary.
Yeah. So what I want is a constrained theory that doesn't allow you to say any of those things. Sorry?
So these arguments are irrelevant. You're just saying people have a bunch of different theories.
None of which work.
Well, that's a different argument.
Well, that was the point I just made here with the Kiowa case, though, right? At least part of the point. I mean, I guess the general thing I want to say is there's 2 aspects to such theories. They all share something. You're right, I keep going on about the range of operations, and I will come back to that.
But that's orthogonal.
It's orthogonal, but it won't stay orthogonal.
It's not orthogonal.
It won't stay orthogonal anyway. Why is it not orthogonal?
Because the theory doesn't give you any restrictions, right? So of course,
well, different.
Any given theorist can say, here's the way I think head movement works, this way, that way, the other way, right? But as far as the vocabulary of the structure building goes, all of them are licit in some sense, and that's the sense of restrictedness that you're talking about.
I think Colin's right that like there's an issue. I mean, so I guess there's a question about using the word theory here, right? So like, I want a theory that basically makes all of these structure building operations where you join heads illicit, because I think that we've just seen that actually you don't need such things to build word structure, and I'm about to show you that the expectation for such movements would be they should feed the semantics, and they don't. So in general, I want to say that we want a theory that rules out all of those kinds of operations. You're right that, like, I'm kind of, it's like I've got boxers around me and I'm going, but like really, like, what I really wanted to say, you guys are all out of the park. So yes, I mean, it's slightly orthogonal here, but it won't stay orthogonal.
Can I just get something on the logic of the argument you just ran? So there's 2 things that two ways of reading what you said, understanding what you said, and I understood it one way until you just said something else. One is that the head movement gets you the wrong answer. That was one set of arguments that you were getting. You don't get the right linear order.
Right.
The other one is that it's not necessary to get you the right answer. Those are 2 different things.
Sure.
The necessary to get you the right answer is an argument for simplicity, so we don't want these structures because we don't need them. The other one is, if we have these structures, they get us the wrong results.
It's the latter that I plan that I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm probably misspoke. But yes, I think the Kiowa case counts as a strong argument that head movement is not involved in word building. And
Because
that's
it gives
one
you
of
the
the
wrong
things.
answer.
Gives you the wrong answer.
Okay.
That's one of the things that I think the head movement is motivated by.
Right, and the mirror principle is just to say, and we can get the right answer using another set of operations or interpretation procedures. But right now, the head movement is bad because it gives you the wrong result.
Gives you the wrong result in this case, right? Okay. And I think that, I think that if you have a solution to this case, that solution will generalize to all the other cases. Okay, so let me just zip through the issue of semantic interpretation.
Dave,
Yeah.
can I just a quick question?
Yeah. Do you want to hear about what my story for this is?
No, it's about Kiowa.
Okay, okay, in that case, yes, definitely.
In the book, you show that there actually is a way to do it with head movement if you assume that there's extra projections above it, and then you have to stipulate how far
Yeah.
head movement does or doesn't go.
So that's what I said when I said, and in the book we look at other ways of dealing with the relationship between the preverbal particles and the head. So that was exactly that bit, and sure they don't work.
Well, they don't not work. They just require stipulations.
Okay.
And no, but that's important because then the argument is on rather shaky ground in the following sense. What you've shown is that a theory that you can do Kiowa without head movement and doing it with head movement requires stipulations. But that means that it's enough for me to find one language that the mirror theory can't account for, and then there's an argument for the exact opposite conclusion that you're advocating here. Namely, you need these, just add those stipulations and get Kiowa, because over here I have something that I can only do with
Well,
head
I
movement.
don't think any of those stipulations are stipulations that anyone would want to have, right?
Okay.
I mean, they're kind of crazy stipulations that say we repeat everything at every level, right? And then you have to have a theory that stops you, you have to have some set of stipulations that then stops you having all of the non-repeated bits in the places you don't want them. I mean, it's a hideous, hideous theory that I don't think anyone would want to buy. So that's why I skipped over here. Sorry?
That's why nobody reads the book.
That's why nobody reads it. Okay, so let me run through this because I do want to give you my story actually. So the next argument basically goes, it's pretty difficult to find good cases where head movement has a semantic effect, right? And I think that this isn't dispositive of this argument, but it sort of nudges you to think, okay, well maybe it's not part of the structure building operation. I don't think this isn't intended to be a knockdown argument. It's intended to be an appeal to your sense of good aesthetics. Okay, so that's the way this argument's going to go. This is actually a difficult argument to make for other reasons, because you're kind of arguing against a negative, right? And so a bit like a game of whack-a-mole or something, right? You know, one pops up and you're like, bang, and then one pops up over here and you're like, bang. But I think that none of them really work well. Okay? So a classic argument comes from McCloskey in 1996, and this is kind of, you know, an interesting argument, I think. It's actually not clear that the data is as sharp as one might hope, but let's pretend it is and give it the best chance. So if you have a look at this paradigm from McCloskey, which Roberts picks up on in his head movement book, which one of them does anybody like? Right, which is a bit odd. Which one of them doesn't anybody like, which is fine, and which one of them does anybody not like? Which one of them does anybody, I don't know why that's there. That doesn't help us. So which one of them does anybody like? Okay, not good, but if we take the negation and we put it in front of and we put it, you know, in C, right, then apparently it becomes okay again. This is not good. Which one of them does anybody not like? Well, it's good, but it's weird. I don't know why that's there. I think that's a cut and paste. My apologies. Okay, theoretical problem with this that you could try and get around with various kinds of stipulations is that, of course, most people's theories of derivations of something like this involves this kind of head adjunction thing. So you need some kind of story to make sure that the negation here is actually high up enough to C-command the anybody here. Now there are such stories. You can define C-command in various ways so that it can't see adjunction. And if you look at Ian Roberts' book, the way he essentially does it is he says that, well, if we look at the full range of facts, that's going to give us some problems. The best we can do is to say that really the licensing feature is already on C. Right? It agrees with negation, and a side effect of that agreement is head movement. So this is the best worked out theory of this particular phenomenon. I'm not saying you can't get a better worked out theory, but it's the best one I can find. And it turns out that actually it's not really saying that movement is giving you the semantic effect. It's saying there's an agreement relationship that's doing that, and movement is a side effect. Okay. So, you know, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think that, you know, it's at least worthwhile thinking this is not the strongest of arguments, Robert's argument. The paper that everyone cites on this stuff is actually two papers by Vinnie Lechner. Okay? And Lechner gives a very complex argument that is to do with split scope readings. So, have a look at the sentence in 24. Not everybody can make the team. It's a bunch of readings, that sentence, but Lechner argues that one of the readings is, and it's correct, It's not possible that every boy makes the team. So it's not possible. So negation here, and then possible here, that every boy makes the team. Okay. So we split negation in a sense from every boy. That's a split scope. Okay. Lechner argues that he takes not every boy to be some kind of unit with a negative element, like an uninterpretable feature on it. And he says that it's a strong quantifier, and strong quantifiers can never reconstruct below tense. So you get some arguments that you don't want to say that the split scope reading is because basically not everybody's interpreted down here, and then we get not can every boy. He says no, you can never interpret the trace of not every boy below T. Therefore, that has to be interpreted here in the scope of negation. So this is the real negation here, right? And then can is moving beyond it to get the split scope reading, right? So if you move can, you get it, and if you don't move can, you don't. And therefore, the movement of can has a semantic effect, right? Everyone loves this paper, but like you can see just the way I explained it, how many auxiliary assumptions that are slightly dubious that it requires. And the most dubious one, noticed by my student David Hall in his thesis, is that actually universal quantifiers in fact can scope below tense. So David gives the example, it's slightly difficult, but not every book, so the scenario is we've got a bunch of footballers, and they've all got agents, and they're complaining, and then someone says to one of the footballers, well, what's one of the agents? Not every book about him can appear to each footballer to be well written. Not every book about him can appear to each footballer to be well written. Yeah? And that has a reading that it's not possible for it, at least one reading that goes, it's not possible for it to appear to each of the footballers, right, that every book about that footballer is well written. But that requires you to take not every book and scope it well below T. Is everyone with me? Everyone's like, no, we're not doing split scope readings and reconstruction. It's the end of the day. Anyway, you can. So I'll send the slides out and you can think about it. Okay. But if it's the case that these sentences are good, and I think they are, then obviously, well, we can just get the relevant reading. We're leaving can where it is and having not every boy scope down here. And Lechner's argument falls into pieces. Okay, so that's another argument that really head movement has semantic effects, and it doesn't seem to fly. There's a bunch more, but as I said, it's a bit whack-a-mole and it's a bit boring to go through them all. I don't think that there's any that are really knocked down. So we have good arguments the word formation is not fed by head movement. We need some independent mechanism. There aren't any compelling arguments that the hierarchical changes lead to semantic, they feed semantics. Okay? And then this is the point that Colin says shouldn't really matter, but I still feel there's an embarrassment of theoretical devices, right? I just sort of feel like I don't want them all. And so I think what we want is a theory which is, this goes back to the simplicity and restrictiveness, we want a theory which is simple and restrictive and doesn't have these effects. Okay? So we want a theory that says that there is no hierarchy changing head movement. We still want to get the data that we've talked about, the Kiowa data and all that other stuff. Okay, remember we said, let's see what time we're at. We're slightly past time, but we had a couple of questions, right? All right, so we talked a bit earlier on about the unification of merge and move here, but I mentioned there's this third possibility, right, where alpha and beta are the same object, both alpha. Okay? So that's what I'm going to use essentially as a means of getting the effects of head movement. Right? So I'm actually going to just get rid of functional heads as you know and love them. There won't be any functional heads, right? There'll be functional categories. What the categories are going to do is decorate the various bits of structure that you build through self-merge. So you imagine you've got a root, like cat, right? Then the idea is you take cat and you merge cat with cat, and you get a set containing cat, right? A set is defined by its members. It's got this, a set with cat and cat in it, is just the set containing just cat, right? Basic set theory. Okay, so we build a piece of structure through self-merge, and we get a structure, a set containing just cat, that needs a label. Okay? So this idea of self-merge has been used by other people, but they tend to stop here, whereas I just let it go all the way. Right? So if we have a look at this derivationally, basically we take cat, we self-merge it, we get a structure containing cat that needs a label, and at this point we've got roots. Now every system needs to be able to say what label a root can have. You can list it with the roots, or you can be flexible like Borera's. We have to start off somewhere. Okay? So let's just say that cat is a noun. Okay? And then we have a new object, this object. Now that's the object that we now self-merge. Okay? If we self-merge that object, then we get a new object that we now still needs a label. Okay? How do we get the label of that? Well, here's where I appeal to basically extended projections. So as you probably know, an extended projection is just the range of functional categories that typically take as their complements parts of structure. Okay? So for above a noun, you'll typically have something like classifier, and then number, then quantifiers, determiner, case, that kind of stuff. Okay? So the idea is to say that we really have no idea why we have no idea why extended projections are organized in the way they are. Right? Well, I don't have no idea. We have a few ideas about why they're organized in the way they are. So we essentially stipulate them currently. We don't want to stipulate them forever, and so we want to have a good theory about why they are the way they are. But at the moment, we have no idea. Okay? So let's just take the fact that extended projections look however they look empirically as a given, and say some other theory is going to have to handle that. Okay? If we've got that, then what we can do is appeal to that for the next label up. So essentially, how do we know what the category of dot here is? Well, we look at the extended projection, and we choose from what's above the extended projection what the label will be. And then you can iterate that process. You can then self-merge that, generate another piece of structure, you look yet further up the extended projection and choose that. The way I present it in the book, and I think this is still correct, languages choose different things that are in their extended projections. So some languages might lack an honorific or a classifier. I mean, I don't think classifier actually, but you might choose your various things. So you'll have an extended projection, which is part of your knowledge of your language, and then you just build up these things. So they end up being like sort of like spears that you can thrust into a lexical root and kind of go like, aha, got you now, cat, and now I can compute with you, right? Because you've got this stuff. Okay. So you can see how this is then going to get you the effects of head movement quite straightforwardly. So I haven't told you how I'm going to merge in this numeral here. We can do that tomorrow. But basically, what you can do is you self-merge cat up to some kind of classifier. I'm just assuming a Borerian kind of structure for this. You stick in 3 as the specifier of num, okay? And then you go up to D. Right? So what you're going to do then is you're going to pronounce 3 as 3. We'll talk about that tomorrow. And you pronounce cat as this whole thing here, right? Which will be cats. And you pronounce it in English here. Specifiers precede their heads. I use head in the sense of whatever that is, right? Specifiers precede their heads, so you get 3 cats. Imagine you're in a language where you pronounce it here, right? Heads precede whatever is down below them, so you get cats, 3. So the height of the noun there is simply given by a diacritic to say where you want to pronounce it. Now you might think, but that's really boring. It is really boring, but that's exactly what every theory does. Every theory says the head moves to this position for some reason. Right? We've already so what this does is it radically dissociates the head where the position is in the tree of the pronunciation of the head, right, from the word building structure of the head. I mean, there's still you can see that the root cat in this extended projection with a plural number here is going to be pronounced as cats in English, right? So the morphology is an aspect of this, just like we saw in the Kiowa case. The where it's pronounced is simply given by a diacritic. So the syntax, the structure, doesn't tell you where it's pronounced, right? But that seems right? Because this diacritic is simply a diacritic that feeds the morphology. It's not feeding the semantics, right? Which I think we saw was what we wanted. Okay, so some consequences. Obvious ones, since there are no heads, there are no head positions to move to, so structure changing head movement is unstatable in this system. Right? So actually, all of the various ways that the current approaches to dealing with head movement use, parallel merge and sideways merge and so on, they are OTOs currently. Okay? They're going to be impossible by the time I'm finished on Wednesday, but currently we don't need them. Okay? So the system makes head adjunction actually impossible, but the other things I haven't said anything about yet. Okay, so there's no projection from heads, so actually this whole recent series of papers by Chomsky about the labeling problem are all irrelevant. I mean, they're not irrelevant, very interesting ideas and probably some very cool things about agreement and so on in there, but actually as far as the labeling problem that Chomsky's been addressing in his papers, it just doesn't arise in this system because there is no projection from heads. Right? So we don't have to worry about it. And then the head movement effects, the height effects, are captured by a spell-out diacritic, and word formation is basically read off of the properties of the extended projection. And then finally, some larger points, which just recap what I started off with. So what I've done is given a system where actually it's more optimized than the standard system to the compositional meaning, right? In that there isn't syntactic work in terms of structure building done without, I mean, all of the structure building has semantic interpretation attached to it. Okay? Yeah, okay, the last point is the relevant point. So we haven't yet ruled out all of the other things, right? This system, you can do parallel merging, right? You can do sideways movement in, right? Because they really have got to do with specifiers, or can have to do with specifiers. I've said nothing about that so far. So, you know, and roll up, I haven't said it, it turns out that won't be doable in the system, but you don't know how yet. Okay, that's tomorrow. So it turns out that this system, although as it stands, we haven't ruled out all of the menageries, so we don't need a bunch of it. And by Wednesday, I'll have ruled them all out. So that's the story. Yeah, Norbert.
So can I just want to run two by you. One we talked about at lunch, and I just wanted to sort of raise it in general because it still strikes me as the most interesting argument for something like head movement. And that's the lack of obviation effects when you have cliticization. That's not a rule of the type that you've been looking at, which basically builds new words. It's where you have a DP that seems to move over a long distance. And you know, why it is that the clitic doubling, you know, obviates intervention effects.
Yeah.
So that's number one. The second one I wanted to sort of run by you was that there was an interesting argument that I know of, where head movement feeds the syntax, meaning in the following way. So the height of the verb correlates with the possibility of VP ellipsis.
Okay.
You know, so what happens is in languages like English, where you don't have head raising, you can get VP ellipsis. In languages like, say, Portuguese, where you do have head raising, you have the analog of ellipsis, but you have to pronounce the verb again. And in some languages like Japanese, you can't get VP ellipsis at all unless you, as it were, scramble the whole expression around the height to a left joined position, and then what you can do is you can get what appears to be ellipsis again. Takahashi. And that actually seems like an argument that where you have head movement correlating with a syntactic, with something we think of as a syntactic option, right? Ellipsis. So if you think that ellipsis is part of the syntax, or some part of ellipsis is some part of the syntax, you now have a correlation between that and head movement, which seems to suggest that head movement itself should be part of the syntax. I just wanted to throw it out.
Okay, so I was thinking about the clitic doubling effects, because Omer also raised them earlier on, like when we were discussing things in your blog, I believe, right? So I have no idea how to do clitic doubling. So I'm making this up. In fact, I made it up just before this, right? But I think what I can do is in this system essentially mimic what, say, a Matushansky system would have to do the obviation effect going away with clitic doubling. So basically everyone knows, I'm not giving the data here, but basically the idea is that if you have a clitic doubled argument, right, it doesn't act as an intervener between two elements on either side of it. Right? If you don't have it clitic doubled, it acts as an intervener. Okay, so this is Anagostopoulos and Omer and various other people who pointed this out. So here's my attempt to make this work. But I don't really have a theory of agreement, so I'm kind of making this up as I'm going along. So imagine we've got this kind of system. Imagine this is Basque, okay? And we've got a dative argument and a specifier of an applicative category. And we've got an accusative argument and the specifier of whatever your favorite category is for introducing objects. ASP something. I call it O. Okay? So you might imagine then that what happens for intervention in a system like this is you'll have some uninterpretable feature, agreement feature in T. It's going to search down the tree and it's going to essentially agree with whatever phi feature it can find on a DP. So this looks a bit crazy and I'll talk a bit about it tomorrow, but basically this is a KP, right, with a bunch of features on it. So a case phrase with a bunch of features on it. And that's the dative one, the spec of apple, and there's the applicative, and there's the accusative one in the spec of O. So this comes down here, and it's searching, and the thing it hits first is this, right? Because this requires 2 extra steps. So this is going to give an intervention effect. The dative is going to intervene as we want for the accusative. Okay. Now, let's say that what clitics are is essentially when you have uninterpretable phi on K rather than interpretable phi. Okay. That agrees on apple. Okay. Deletes this stuff here, so basically the phi features are too low in the dative, and then you don't get the intervention. Then what you do is you pronounce that U phi as the clitic. Now, I'm not saying this is a good story, right? It's a bit, I just made it up, right? The point I want to make is that it requires a particular stipulation, and that stipulation, right, is equivalent in terms of the kind of number of things you need to say to the stipulation that you need to say with the head movement story.
That's a great phrase, by the way, the Matushansky gambit.
Yeah.
It sounds like something out of chess, right?
Yeah. So
sacrifice a clitic to allow intervention.
Sorry?
Sacrifice
a clitic. Oh, that's great. Yeah, sacrifice a clitic to allow intervention. And that's essentially the idea, right? And that's, and that's sort of the idea of all of the stories. All of the stories for this are a bit like that, right? So I think that, this does not count as an argument for head movement, right? It's doable in this system. I don't know whether that's the right story, but I just want to make the general logical point that it's not necessarily an argument for head movement per se, for that way of doing this. On the ellipsis stuff, I need to tell you about my story for ellipsis, so that really requires you to understand what's happening tomorrow. So in auxiliary type structures where you have ellipsis, I actually put the VP in the specifier. So the thing that looks like it's the head is really, it is the head in a sense, but it's a root, right? And then that's the thing that phonologizes the entire projection. So you can easily, and then the height of that, where that is, right, where you do that in the functional sequence, in the extended projection, will give you the correlation that you're after. I'm pretty sure, I haven't thought it through, but at least the story that I'm giving for auxiliary type structures is that the only problem might be cases where you get ellipsis. Yeah, I don't think there are any cases that are problematic actually. Okay. I was going to say there might be a case where you get ellipsis with no governing head, but then that wouldn't interact with the problem that you give. So I don't think that's a problem. Okay. That went all techie, sorry. Yeah, Harold.
That's very, very interesting stuff. So there are 2 ways in principle one could go from what you've shown us today. One is to say, okay, we went through a lot of reasons for thinking contrary to popular belief, head movement doesn't exist. So the next place we can go is contrary to popular belief, A movement doesn't exist. Martin doesn't exist. Or we could go say, well, head movement is just a thing it's just very different in its nature from these other things.
Absolutely.
Okay, given that particular point of view, I'm wondering about sort of your slogan about all movement having semantic effects, how that's compatible with a movement of a pleonastic or a movement in the check, which seems very well motivated.
So yeah, it's a very good problem. So what I was thinking with respect to A movement is, of course, well, A movement does feed semantics, right? So it creates new binding domains and so on. So I guess it's okay, I hadn't thought about that. That's a very good problem. I guess there are two ways of thinking about the slogan. One is where it generalizes across classes of movements, in which case it would still hold. The other one, whereas it generalizes across actual instances of movement, in which case your examples would be problematic. Yeah, that's a very good point. I don't know why I hadn't thought about that. Let me think about that.
Yeah, I worry that sort of trying to generalize the class for the same reason I've been worrying since, I guess, about 1979, when Chomsky first said it. He was trying to define a position. No one has yet successfully defined it, but his definition then, here's an Elgin debate, is an A position is a potential theta position.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Well, if you pick the right verb, it would be a theta position.
Yeah, so it's similar. Yeah, so it's a similar kind of solution to my class solution. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm in good company in having that problem. Yeah, I need to think about that actually. Thanks. That's a really very good point. Yeah.
Well, you could, if depending on how you do the semantics, you could do something that would amount to saying that you can't have something that would, in effect, change the interpretation you would have had in the base position. And you know what I mean?
No.
Well, if the expletive's not going to be, there's not going to be a different interpretation if you interpret it down low than down high, because.
So that means it shouldn't be allowed to move.
No, if you said that you can't change something, then you wouldn't be changing anything because it would have been the same.
You must be changing something, or you can't have the movement.
Yeah.
But there always must be a semantic effect.
And that's, what I'm saying is exactly what Howard said. So, you don't do syntactic work unless it has an effect.
Sorry,
on
I had a
semantics.
different thought in my mind that got crossed with. Sorry.
No, these are pleonastics. You might say, they denote an event, or and even though I don't like this is actually what I've occasionally called the Koopman gambit, which is, well, there's semantic effects that are just so subtle, you never get to the point of being able to detect them, right? I'm not keen on that, but yeah. So maybe you can think of pleonastics as involving a situation variable, and moving it just doesn't do anything with respect to scope. Idiom chunks? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
This is maybe a definitional question. By structure building, did you mean things that were binary branches in the trees you were drawing?
I meant addition and structure. So
but then
if you allow unary
those,
branching,
but then all of your cocktail spines are
addition and structure, and they all have a semantic effect.
They all do, always. And what are those semantic effects?
So let's take an extended projection, for example.
Yeah.
So basically, you've got the root n, and then maybe that just denotes a concept like cat or something. Then you've got n. Maybe what that does is it goes lambda p lambda x p of x or something. So it turns that concept into a predicate.
So that counts.
Then you've got classifier, and what that does is it makes sure that it denotes from a particular kind of lattice. Then you've got number, and that sort of says, well, we cut the lattice into plurals and singulars, and then we've got definite, so each of these items is intended to have a semantic effect.
So there's no phi heads.
There's no phi heads.
But
I have an issue with case, and I don't know how to solve case. So that is my one situation.
Gender.
I'm not so fussed about it. Okay.
But I mean
Maybe that's just a diacritic though, not a head. Right, so it's maybe not a category, it's just a diacritic. Case is maybe also just a diacritic, although that's not how I've been handling it. But yeah,
But there's a concomitant theory of, for example, if you thought that quantifiers were just going to be relations between sets, they're not of individuals. They're not that anymore because, in fact, often they're going to have to be fed these guys, which in order to comply with this constraint would have to have been given additional semantics in order to underwrite the principle, right? So for instance, part of the job, if you're going to follow that slogan, is to now rephrase the semantics of quantifiers so that it's not relations between sets, it's relations between something richer.
I don't see why. I mean,
Well, because by the time, if you started off with the thing at the bottom, say cats being a set of cats, and you had to slap on a bunch of junk, then presumably you're not going to end up with a set of cats because...
well, you end up with whatever semantic type you need to be the first argument of the
Yeah,
German
but say that
qualifier.
were a set of cats for every cat, and say somebody said that down at the bottom when you had noun cat, it stood for a set of cats. But then in order to justify
Yeah.
in a court, you would have had to have done other things out of the
It
set
has,
of cats.
you're right. I mean, I just absolutely correct. I mean, so I'm being very hand-wavy about what the semantics is.
Well, the
of
reason
associating
is, so
these
then
things.
in that case, it's not that I actually don't think, there are people who glom together sets to build individuals out of them and so on, and feed them to quantifiers. But if somebody wanted to argue with you, then the trade-off relation about the thing would be that, I'm just trying to get a clear sense of what the bill of goods is, right?
Yeah.
Because it includes that bill of goods in particular, which a person who thought there were syntactic categories that didn't have particularly interesting semantic correlates because they just took care of morphological work, if you want to put
Yeah.
it that way.
So I'm
would
saying
say
that I'm saying that I
there
don't
are
want to
no-
have
yeah,
those.
there are no syntactic categories.
That's
that don't
why,
have semantic
Umar
correlates.
said gender, case is a big problem. I
Yes.
think things like, determiners and stuff, I mean, I'm not so fussed about it. I think that
But so then it
the dog versus dog, there's a semantic difference there. So, that I'm not fussed about. But I'm worried about, not worried, but certainly things like building a piece of structure which just does, syntactic licensing, which I do currently. But it's a problem, yeah. Or gender, if gender is a syntactic category, on grammatical gender. So those are the kinds of issues, and maybe I did say it's optimized to the semantics. I didn't say it was necessarily optimal. So yeah, I mean, it's maybe just a best fit as opposed to. I mean, I wouldn't like that to be the case, but so it's a sort of meta-theoretical injunction in a sense, right, rather than anything else.
So can I ask, getting back to the one the strong argument you gave us from Kiowa, is that what it's called? Kiowa. You are assuming that a theory of head movement must give you a theory of word order, right? Because it relies on the fact that I'm not going to get the order of the terminals correctly. But everyone in the debate is assuming that whatever the syntax does, it does not in and of itself give you a theory of word order. So what was the theory, because I can imagine having all the head movement you want, and with a judicious set of spell-out operations, getting you whatever word order you want out of that thing. And in fact, that's not unlike what you're doing, because you have a diacritic here, you have a diacritic there, you have a diacritic there. So the link between the argument that says Kiowa shows you can't have head movement relies on principles of linearization that I don't think I saw you provide. So what are
Requires principles of linearization for approaches that adopt head movement.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm saying that it's certainly consistent to have a theory of head movement that does not say that head movement, that there's a transparent mapping between the movement operations and the morphology.
Yeah.
Right. That's in fact what you're assuming as well. So the question is going to be, why? Maybe what your argument is, that's all it really aimed to do, was to give you that. That I'm not sure of, because I don't know enough about that literature. But just not being able to translate into a theory of word order doesn't seem to me a sufficient reason for thinking that head movement doesn't exist, because no one thinks that it should translate into, by itself, a theory of word order.
Well, I think that last proposition is false.
False.
There are clearly people that think that, right?
Well, they shouldn't think it.
So,
No,
I mean,
what you
if
said
Kai
at
was
the
right, they
beginning,
certainly
you shouldn't
shouldn't,
think
right?
it.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, so the idea would be, imagine you had a theory that